Hello, everybody. It's my privilege to introduce you to Mr. Richard W. Hatcher III, who is a native of Richmond, Virginia, and in 1973 graduate of Virginia Commonwealth University with a BA in history. His lifelong love of the subject began during the Civil War centennial and grew when he later worked as a seasonal employee at Richmond National Battlefield Park. Rick began working permanently with the National Park Service in 1976 and retired as a historian from Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie National History Park in 2015. Rick is an author or co-author of numerous articles and books, including the award-winning Wilson's Creek, the second major battle of the Civil War, and the men who fought it in 2001, and the first shot in 2011. He's a regular on the Civil War speaking circuit. So I'm gonna get out of the way and we can learn from Rick.
So good evening, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm very impressed at how active your historical society is and all the good work y'all are doing. So please continue in that vein. Very impressive. As you may remember, they said before I came to Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie National Historical Park to be the historian, I worked at Wilson's Creek National Battlefield outside of Springfield, Missouri. It's the first major battle of the Civil War west of the Mississippi River. So when I worked there, I was Ranger Rick from Wilson's Creek. That's who you're dealing with. Give you a heads up on that. So, Fort Sumter, when we think of Fort Sumter, we think, of course, of April 12th and 13th, 1861. And before we go any further, they had to change the program to a PDF format, so the font is off a little bit as we go through the program. So just kind of keep that in mind. But this is what we think of Fort Sumter. April 12th and 13th, 1861, that bombardment that marked a defining moment in our nation's history, what we call the Civil War, the war between the states, the war of northern aggression if you're from the South, things like that, as I am. But, and people think that after that the war left Fort Sumter and Charleston. It goes to the battlefields up in Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, etc. But what we're going to do tonight is going to go over and let you see the long history of this fort and the critical role it played in the war overall. So the beginning of our story, we have to go back to the War of 1812, especially August 24th, 25th, 1814, when British troops captured, ransacked, and burned the nation's capital. So after the War of 1812, the United States government realizes how weak our national defenses are. And in President James Madison's December 5th, 1815 State of the Union address, he included, quote, a call for a liberal provision for the immediate extension and gradual completion of the defense of our maritime coast. So this leads us to what we know in the history world here in our nation as the Third Coastal Defense System. The Third Coastal Defense System will start after the War of 1812, will run until 1867, and there will be 42 forts built along our nation's coastlines to protect us against an invasion from the sea. And what a lot of people don't realize, this is the first national federal construction project in the history of the United States. So we can go from Fort Knox in Maine all the way down to Fort Jefferson and drive to Tortugas and the Florida Keys. We could go to the forts along the Gulf Coast, all the way out to Fort Point under the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Those are all forts built into this Third Coastal Defense System. Now, as you can see from this slide, we already have 3 forts in the defense of Charleston Harbor, but all of these are second system forts built before the War of 1812. And we're also got to remember, we're in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. Great advances are being made with steam power, and also great advances are being made in development with larger cannons and bigger ships, kind of like we saw the war vessel shown a few minutes ago was obsolete well before the American Civil War starts. So if we're going to have bigger ships with bigger guns, we're going to need bigger forts bigger guns to counteract that. So you can see the three forts. We have Fort Moultrie, of course, on Sullivan's Island at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, where y'all are going on your field trips. I was a historian there as well. Then we have Fort Johnson over there on James Island. Now, Fort Johnson had been destroyed pretty much by a hurricane in 1813, and the United States government decided not to rebuild it. So there's still government property and there's still things there, but it's no longer really a fort there. And then of course we have Castle Pinckney just down the river from us here on Chutes Valley Island, and that was also completed. That was actually completed in 1810. So, but once again, it's determined these forts are inadequate as other forts along our coastlines, and we need to build a newer fort. And so a site is selected to build a new fort here in Charleston Harbor, about a mile from Fort Moultrie, across the main channel on a shoal. You can see it, right here, Fort Sumter in the oval. See the oval there. That's the site selected, and construction starts in 1829. Now, first of all, you got to build a foundation. So they're going to bring in 109,000 tons of rock and granite and build an artificial island about 2.5 acres in size, sitting 5 feet above the surface of the harbor at high tide. The center of that pentagon, you can see from the rock mole in the upper left-hand illustrated, that will become the parade ground. That's going to be filled with seashells and other items and filled with sand to become the interior of the parade ground of the fort. The exterior walls, pentagon-shaped fort, these walls are 7 feet thick. They will stand over 48 feet above the foundation of the fort. And they will mount 3 tiers of cannons, for the most part, on 4 of the principal walls. A first tier of casemated gun rooms, second tier of casemated gun rooms, then the third barbette tier above that on the 4 principal walls facing the Atlantic Ocean, the channel, and into the harbor. The fort is designed to hold 135 cannons within its walls and was to have living space inside for 650 officers and men. So it's a large, impressive defensive structure. Now, 4 years into the construction, the Adjutant General's office in Washington, D.C. issued orders naming 9 forts under construction. And one of those is the one here in Charleston Harbor, and it's named Fort Sumter. It is named after Brigadier General Thomas Sumter. Thomas Sumter is the South Carolina Gamecock, fought in the American Revolution, became a militia general in the South Carolina forces, and when he dies in 1832 at the age of 97, he is the last surviving general officer of the American Revolution, and the fort is named in his honor. But what's even more important to me is I'm a native Virginian, so is Thomas Sumter. So the most famous fort, in my opinion, in United States history is named after a fellow Virginian. So construction of the fort continues on until we get to December of 1860. It is nearing completion, but construction stops in December of 1860 because on the 20th of December of that year, South Carolina secedes from the Union. Right here in Charleston, construction stops and everything will go from a construction mode to a defensive mode. So here we can see illustration showing the secession being held at Institute Hall, or what became known as the Session Hall in downtown Charleston. It's a unanimous decision, and South Carolina is out of the Union. So what's the situation in Charleston Harbor for the military in December of 1860? Castle Pinckney, its garrison consists of 1 sergeant, his wife, and daughter. Fort Johnson has been abandoned since the late 1820s, but this is where the United States Army Corps of Engineers offload all the construction materials for Fort Sumter to ship them over to the construction site. Fort Sumter is a construction site. It's under the jurisdiction of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. They're the builders. So the only garrisoned installation in Charleston Harbor is Fort Moultrie. They're under the command of Major Robert Anderson. Counting himself, he has 84 officers and men altogether in his command. And when he gets here in November of 1860 to assume command, he makes an inspection of the area, And in his first report to Washington, D.C., it included the following. This work, meaning Fort Sumter, is the key to the entrance to this harbor. Its guns command this work and could soon drive out its occupants. It should be garrisoned immediately. Approximately 2 weeks later, in another report, December 9, 1860, he writes, Fort Sumter is a tempting prize, the value of which is well known to the Charlestonians, and once in their possession, with its ammunition and armament, and garrisoned properly, it would set our Navy at defiance and compel me to abandon this work, meaning Fort Moultrie, and give them the perfect command of this harbor. So he is repeatedly telling the authorities in Washington how important Fort Sumter is, and we better do something about it. The administration under President James Buchanan is lame duck. He's waiting to go out of office. This guy named Abraham Lincoln from Illinois, the incoming president, says, I'm gonna put this monkey on your back. It's not gonna be on my back, it's gonna be on your back. So, but during all this, Anderson's requesting reinforcement supplies, etc. And the Buchanan administration just sends him words. That's the only things he gives him. But within those messages he's receiving from Buchanan's administration, he is allowed to move his command into whatever defensive position in Charleston Harbor that he thinks is the best to secure his command and hopefully avoid the effusion of blood, as it was called at the time. So on the night of December 26, 1860, he transfers the command from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter and starts putting that in the best state of defense that he can. Now, it's shortly after that, on January 9, 1861, that Buchanan's Buchanan finally attempts to send food and reinforcements to Fort Sumter, but that is turned back by the firing on the Star of the West by the Citadel Cadets out there on Morris Island. And the Citadel Cadets, of course, claimed to have fired the first shots of the war. So, at the same time, of course, South Carolina forces are move into Fort Moultrie, Castle Pinckney, etc. in the area, and start building their own earthen defenses to protect Charleston Harbor in their mind. And of course, as we get into 1861, more states to secede from the Union. In fact, counting South Carolina, all the deep South states over to Texas secede. They send representatives to Montgomery, Alabama, the first capital of the Confederacy, form the Confederate States of America in February of 1861. And in March, they send the first commissioned brigadier general in the Confederate Army, Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard, is sent over to command all the Confederate forces now here in Charleston Harbor. Now, while all this has been going on before Beauregard got here, Governor Francis Pickett has been trying to negotiate Anderson out of Fort Sumter, and then Beauregard takes over that duties, communicating with the authorities in Montgomery, Alabama. Anderson says, essentially, unless I am ordered out, starved out, or bombed out, I'm not leaving. That's the bottom line. And of course, President Lincoln now sends a relief expedition down. The Confederates know it's coming, and when Anderson refuses the final evacuation or request or demand by the Confederates at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, the bombardment of Fort Sumter begins. This will run for 34 hours, with the Confederates firing over 3,000 artillery shells and solid shot at the fort over the course. They have a total of 43 heavy guns directed at the fort from north. So up here at the battery on Mount Pleasant to the north, to the south at Cummings Point on Morris Island, to the east of Fort Moultrie and batteries there, and then of course over here at Fort Johnson to the west. So essentially they got them surrounded with artillery. Finally, when the fort surrenders on April 13th, 1861, this gives you an idea. This is a section of one of the exterior walls of the fort. An estimated 600 heavy artillery rounds have slammed in to the exterior walls of the fort. None of them go through the 7-foot thick wall, but they do obviously create some damage. But on the interior, it's much worse. There we go. So mortars with high angle fire, and they take their solid cast iron cannonballs and heat them in furnaces until they're red hot. And those red hot cast iron cannonballs come up over the walls of the fort, land in the officers' quarters, the buildings on fire. Exploding shells are doing the same thing from the mortars and cannons, and the interior of the fort burns, essentially, completely. So this is a photograph of one of the barracks buildings in the fort. It used to be, it was 3 stories high. You can see it's a burned out shell. The roof is completely gone. You can see damage to those chimneys sticking up above the line of the 3rd floor. Here's 2 more images. The one in the upper left shows the officers' quarters and buildings along the gorge wall, completely destroyed by the fire. And then the lower right, that is the other enlisted men's barracks. Once again, no roof line left. It's completely gutted by fire. The 3-story building is completely burned. So, the Federals are allowed to evacuate. Confederates move in and start repairing the damages. This is a photograph taken shortly after the bombardment with a group of laborers, men there to rebuild the fort and put it back in a defensive posture, ready to defend against the Union attack. And so overall, what does this bombardment of Fort Sumter mean? First of all, on April 15th, President Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to serve 90 days to suppress the rebellion. As a result of that, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Missouri all secede from the Union. They refuse to supply troops to fight against their sister southern states. So now the Confederacy goes from 7 states to 13, which has great symbolism for the Confederacy because we have 13 original colonies that fought the British in the American Revolution. Now we have 13 U.S. states, now Confederate states, fighting for another war of independence in their eyes. So, also, what this means to the North. The secession in Charleston on December 20th of 1861, that's where treason began in the South. The firing on Fort Sumter, that's where rebellion began. So it's going to be of great morale importance to the United States to take Fort Sumter and Charleston back, to help boost the morale in their war effort to restore the Union. But they also realized something else that's very important. Charleston is the largest and active and most important seaport on the Atlantic coast of the Confederacy. We're going to load up ships with cotton, rice, indigo, and other goods and ship them overseas and bring goods back in, military goods and other goods to help keep the Confederacy alive. So this is the lifeline of the Confederacy on the Atlantic coast of this new nation. At the same token, so it's going to be of great strategic importance for the United States to capture Charleston, to cut off that lifeline, that supply line, that shipping supply line that the Confederacy has here. So, other side of that coin, of course, the Confederacy, the South. This is where they began their war for independence and nationhood. Charleston is the cradle of the Confederacy. The firing on Fort Sumter is their shot to be fired, heard around the world in their bid for independence and nationhood. So once again, it's a great morale factor for the Confederacy to keep Fort Sumter and Charleston in their hands. And of course, obviously they know it's the most important seaport, shipping port on the Atlantic coast of the Confederate States of America. They want to keep this seaport open. And as hard as the United States Navy and Army tried, Charleston would be the most successful blockade running port for the Confederacy with a 70% success rate. So it's going to be a lot of attention here. So the United States, their first major victory in the Deep South, to come down here and see about taking Charleston back, they take Port Royal on November 7th, 1861. So you see it's located between Savannah and Charleston. Of course, that's where the Marine Corps base is, the air base down there. And beautiful Port Royal and Beaufort, the town there. So There, the United States Navy will establish the headquarters or the Navy base for the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, and the United States Army, the headquarters are based for the Department of the South. So for the rest of the war, all the United States Army and Navy's operations against the coastlines of South Carolina, Georgia, and the Atlantic coast of Florida will be out of Port Royal. So the first major victory for the United States in the war is here in South Carolina, and just a little ways down the road. Now we move into April of 1862, and General John C. Pemberton is in command of the Department of South Carolina and Georgia, and things aren't going well for him in April. On April 6th and 7th, up in Tennessee, there's a battle called the Battle of Shiloh, major battle. And after that battle, Confederate forces fell back down to their base at Corinth, Mississippi. They suffered tremendous losses, both sides did. But General Pemberton gets an order from Richmond saying, send 4 regiments, infantry regiments, to help replace the losses that Confederates suffered at Shiloh. So he sends 2 regiments out of the defenses of Savannah, and 2 out of the defenses of Charleston. Just a few days later, United States forces have already moved up on Tybee Island below Fort Pulaski and opened fire on it with artillery, and for the first time, batteries of rifle artillery, and in 30 hours, they punch holes through the walls, 7-foot thick walls of Fort Pulaski, and it surrenders. So the Federals move in and take Fort Pulaski. They don't move up and take Savannah, but Savannah is essentially cut off now as a blockade running port for the Confederacy. And so Pemberton's obviously not happy. And then shortly after that, up in Virginia, up here, at this time, a Union general by the name of George McClellan has got about 100,000 Union soldiers landed on the peninsula of Virginia down around Fort Monroe, and are moving up the peninsula to see about capturing Richmond. Richmond needs to be defended. Pemberton gets another order from Richmond. Send us Maxcy Gregg's brigade of South Carolina infantry out of your defenses. So now 4 more regiments are gone, and also you're sending a battery of artillery. So now Pemberton has lost 8 infantry regiments in his defensive command and an artillery battery. And now he realizes he can't hold all these isolated coastal posts along the Georgia and South Carolina coastline. So he starts pulling back. He evacuates Georgetown, pulls all the troops, everything out of that, as an example. And word starts getting around that he's considering evacuating Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter to defend Charleston from the interior of the harbor. Governor Pickens hears that. He's not a happy man when he hears this. He gets on the phone, he telegraphs President Davis, and says, this is what Pemberton's going to do. So Pemberton is getting deeper and deeper in trouble, and then he gets a message from the man, I hope everybody there recognizes on the right, General R.E. Lee. Now, Lee had commanded the Department of South Carolina and Georgia from November of 1861 until March of 1862, when he's ordered back to Richmond and becomes President Davis's military advisor. So Lee is very, very well acquainted with the situation in this department, and this is what he wrote in part to Pemberton on May 29, 1862. The importance of defending Charleston and Savannah to the last extremity, particularly Charleston, is earnestly brought to your attention. The loss of Charleston would cut us off almost entirely from communication with the rest of the world and close the only channel through which we can expect to get supplies from abroad. You will therefore make use of every means at your command to put these cities in the most perfect state of defense. Spare no labor or expense. Let it be distinctly understood by everybody that Charleston and Savannah are to be defended to the last extremity. If the harbors are taken, the cities are to be fought street by street and house by house, as long as we have a foot of ground to stand upon. Pemberton understands that. I got you. And so he doesn't evacuate Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, obviously, he stays, but things continue to go downhill for him, because the very next month, on June 16th, 1862, Union forces have moved up from Port Royal. They land on James Island, and we have the Battle of Secessionville, And now violent, pernicious Yankees are about 6 miles from Charleston. Not good. But Federals are defeated, they fall back to Port Royal, and with that, as we say down south, you can take General Pemberton and stick him with a fork, because he's done. He is ordered away from here, and he will be promoted though from Major General to Lieutenant General, and he will be given command of Confederate forces in East Louisiana and Mississippi. And the next year, on July 4th, 1863, he surrenders Vicksburg. So he's done. His goose was cooked. So replacing him is the hero of Fort Sumter, the Confederacy's first war hero. General Beauregard returns, and he commands the now expanded Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Beauregard is a top graduate from West Point as an engineer officer. He had served for a long time in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers until essentially he resigns when Louisiana secedes. And when Louisiana secedes, he is the superintendent of the United States Military Academy. He served a whopping 6 days. He's the shortest term superintendent in the history of the United States Military Academy. But he's an excellent engineer. He greatly improves the defenses here in his department. And he faces his first challenge, on April 7th, 1863. And here we make United States history again, here in this area again, because for the first time in the history of our nation, there's going to be a fleet of non-U.S. ironclad warships go into battle. They will be carrying 32 heavy guns, and they will face 77 heavy Confederate guns and mortars along Morris Island, Sullivan's Island, and at Fort Sumter. This battle is going to last 2.5 hours. A total of 109 U.S. and Confederate cannons are going to wail away at each other. They're going to fire 2,638 rounds of ammunition, totaling over 180,000 pounds of artillery projectiles at each other in 2.5 hours. So Union ships hit numerous times. Some received little damage, some major damage. The USS Keokuk will be hit at least 90 times, 15 rounds penetrating its armor. It will limp out of action, sink the next day off Morris Island. The Confederates will go out later, take both of the 11-inch Dahlgren cannon off of it, put it in the defenses of Charleston. One of those cannons survived. It's down on the battery today. But for all that artillery fired at each other for 2.5 hours, total casualties on both sides will be 21. 4 killed, 10 wounded, 1 mortally wounded, 6 wounded. So the forts and the ironclads did their jobs of protecting the soldiers and sailors. But it was quite a heck of a fight. Now, for this fight, a couple of very interesting things happened. Colonel Alfred Moret, commanding Fort Sumter, wrote this in his report of the battle. At 2 o'clock, the whole ironclad fleet advanced to the attack. At 30 minutes past 2 p.m., the long roll was beaten and every disposition made for action. At 55 minutes past 2 p.m., the garrison regimental and palmetto flags were hoisted and saluted by 13 guns, the band playing the national air, end quote. To confirm this, Private Arthur Grimble in the Confederate Signal Corps in the fort wrote his father after the battle in his letter, and he says that at 2:55 p.m. We fired a salute of 13 guns, dressed the fort in our flags, and a band playing Dixie. Now, to my knowledge, this is the only battle of the Civil War in which there was a formal opening with a band playing a song and raising flags and firing cannons in salute before we really started shooting live ammunition at each other. This is great. And I've been reading about this war since I was 10 years old. I'm 74. So this is the best battle account I have ever read in all these years. Lieutenant William Grimble, Arthur's brother, wrote their sister after the battle. Quote, to sum it up shortly, we fired, they fired. They fired, we fired. When they left, we were glad. When they did not come back, we claimed a wonderful victory. It was the best battle description and quote ever. So, from this, we will go to the Siege of Charleston. June 10th, 1863 until February 18th, 1865. The United States objective is to move up, force the Confederates off Morris Island, mount large breaching artillery pieces on that island, and in conjunction with the United States Navy, bombard Fort Sumter into submission. And when that happens, they believe the United States Navy will be able to fight its way into the harbor of Charleston and force Charleston's surrender. Now, this begins on July 10th, 1863 with an assault on the Confederate positions on the south end of Morris Island. The Federals will take everything up to a place called Battery Wagner. And of course, we're all familiar with that. If the movie Glory, back in 1989, Denzel Washington wins the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. And of course, the Federals are defeated there. They fall back down the island. The U.S. forces move thousands of troops onto the island, thousands of tons of military equipment, everything they need to fight a siege, and start mounting large, heavy cannons on the island. And on August 17th, they're ready to start the first major bombardment of Fort Sumter. It will run until September 2nd, 1863. The United States Army will fire 6,828 heavy rounds at the fort, totaling over 750,000 pounds of artillery projectiles over the course of that event. Now, this photograph, folks on this side, the top, that's rubble, this irregular part, that is the back wall of Fort Sumter where the United States Army directed most of its artillery fire. In fact, the first phase of the bombardment, they fired over 550 pounds of artillery projectiles at that one wall and essentially knocked it down. To get an example of what it was like there, Lieutenant W. Gordon McCabe was sent out there with dispatches during this first major bombardment, and he wrote this in his diary on the night of August 19th. The fort is badly breached. The Farragut guns will soon render Sumter a harmless wreck. Many, indeed, nearly every gun on the south face has been dismounted, and the north face is badly breached by these 200-pounder iron bolts which graze the interior crest of the south face and strike over on the north. While talking to the ordnance officer, we heard rather a louder noise than usual, and looking up after the fall of a mass of masonry overcame a 32-pounder cannon carriage, all knocked off entirely from the parapet onto the parade by one of these huge 200-pounder bolts. So this is an interior photograph of Fort Sumter after that bombardment. There on the, as you're looking at it on the right side, that's what's left of a 3-story high barracks building. You can see the 3rd story is completely gone in the roof. You can see some of the damage being done to the interior walls from the Union shelling, and it's kind of hard to make out. But in the center, there's a hot shot furnace, kind of a little chimney there, and there's one Confederate soldier standing on top of it, another one seated there for the photographer. So with this, now the United States Navy and Marine Corps are going to make an attempt to take Fort Sumter by a night amphibious assault. It's and this is in conjunction because on September 6th and 7th, 1863, the Confederates have finally evacuated their positions on Morris Island, batteries Wagner and Gregg, and during the day of the 7th, Rear Admiral John A. Dahlgren, commanding the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, sends in a surrender demand to Fort Sumter. Its commanding officer forwards that to General Beauregard. General Beauregard responds succinctly, "Tell Admiral Dahlgren he may have Fort Sumter when he can take it and hold it," end quote. So more modern description, hey, you want a piece of me? Come on. What you got? Come on, I'm right here. I'm right here. So Dahlgren responds. He asks for volunteers off of the blockading squadron. He gets 400 sailors and Marines, and carrying 36 caliber Colt revolvers for the most part, and Navy cutlasses and a few short shoulder weapons. they're gonna come ashore in rowboats. Now, the Confederates have broken the Union signal code because when the Confederates got the cannons off the Keokuk after the ironclad attack, they also got the signal code book. And the United States Army and Navy never changed the code. So the men in the Confederate Signal Corps can watch from Fort Sumter and other places and see the signaling going back and forth between the United States Army and Navy, and they know the attack's coming. So the commander of Fort Sumter has all of his men ready up on the ruined parapets of the fort, and as the first waves of boats land and the sailors and Marines come off, the Confederates open up with musket volleys, hand grenades, and other members are taking brick rubble and throwing it down at the Federals, just like that. This fight only lasts 20 minutes. Over 100 sailors and Marines were killed, wounded, captured. The Confederates suffered not a single injury or casualty in that attack. It's a completely one-sided fight. That is the first, last, and only amphibious assault against Fort Sumter. This will be followed up by the second major bombardment of Fort Sumter, which will begin October 26th of 1863 and end on December 6th. Another 18,677 rounds are fired at the fort, an average of one every 3 minutes, 24 hours a day for 41 days. This will be followed by the third major bombardment in 1864 from July 7th to September 4th. This will average 520 rounds a day for 59 days, 14,666, once again, heavy rounds of artillery ammunition. Now keep in mind, once again, Fort Sumter is only 2.5 acres in size. And all of these thousands upon thousands of artillery rounds are being directed at it. Also in 1863-64, Fort Sumter will experience 7 minor bombardments, averaging from a few days to a week, and then 10 reports of desultory fire during that same time period. Of course, the Confederates will continue to hold on to Fort Sumter. That's once again an idea of some of the interior of the fort after these bombardments. The one on the upper left is the interior of the fort. The one on the lower right is the exterior of the fort. The Confederate engineers will come in and using enslaved work gangs from the local plantations, and they will shore up the interior of the fort, as you can see in this 1865 photograph, essentially converting the interior to a giant bomb-proof to protect everyone inside the fort. So finally, when General Sherman's army, advancing to Columbia, South Carolina, arriving there on the night of February 17, 1865, the Confederates here in Charleston are caught between a rock and a hard place. The United States Army and Navy are right out in front of them, and behind them is General Sherman with 60,000 troops. So the Confederates have no choice but to evacuate all their defenses here in Charleston Harbor, including Fort Sumter. Captain Thomas Huguenin is the last Confederate commanding officer of Fort Sumter, and he will write this in his memoir after the war. The pride and glory of Sumter was there, and now in the gloom of darkness we were to abandon her, for whom every one of us would have shed the last drop of his blood. Oh, the irony of fate to give up that historic spot without one last struggle in its defense, end quote. Major John Johnson, in his memoir, he served as the fort's principal engineer for the Confederacy during the war. He wrote, Fort Sumter loomed grandly before their lingering eyes for a few minutes, then the night engulfed it, and they saw it no more. So that brings the war almost to an end at Fort Sumter. But during this siege operation, over 46,000 heavy rounds of artillery ammunition have been fired at Fort Sumter. And in the upper left, you can see a painting of the fort the way it looked in 1860, and in the lower right, from the same angle, you can see what it looked like in 1865. So this totals over 7 million pounds of artillery projectiles fired at that 2.5 acre target, about 3,500 tons. Overall, though, the fort protected the people who were inside it. A total of 339 were casualties. 51 soldiers and 6 Negro laborers and 1 Confederate Corps of Engineers civilian employee who worked there were killed or mortally wounded or died from wounds. Another 185 and 65 of the laborers and a civilian employee were wounded, and 30 soldiers were listed as injured. Not a great return on 7 million pounds of artillery projectiles, but it essentially was destroyed as an artillery post. The last act during the war occurs at Fort Sumter on April 14th, 1865. Major General Robert Anderson returns to Fort Sumter, and with about 3,000 dignitary civilian soldiers, sailors, Marines, and attendants, he will re-raise the same 33-star U.S. flag that had been lowered exactly 4 years earlier on April 14th, 1861. There was a photographer there, and the photographs are in the collections of the Library of Congress. Got those online. They're high-resolution images. Thank goodness the Library of Congress made high-resolution images of all its Civil War photographs during the 150th anniversary just about 10 years ago. And in blowing up some of these images, and the one picture in the upper left, I found Robert Anderson. Now, why he's not sitting in the chair that's behind him, sitting on the dais, we have no idea. But there he is, so know he's there, and this is the only known image of that flag actually being raised over the fort. Unfortunately, it's out of focus, so we can't get a good image, but we can see the border of the flag having that white box there of the larger image of the actual flag going up. After this, United States Army Corps of Engineers comes in, removes rubble and debris, reestablishes Fort Sumter as a 2-tiered fort instead of the original 3-tiered fort that it was. But its primary goal is going to have a navigational light in it for the shipping going in and out of Charleston Harbor after the Civil War. Well, we come up to the Spanish-American War, 1898. There's been great advances made. Of course, brick forts are totally obsolete. So in the middle of Fort Sumter, they built a concrete battery Isaac UG. It mounts two 12-inch, 53-ton cannon that are now firing 900-pound armor-piercing projectiles 10 miles out into the Atlantic. Another thing we have down south, we got some big dogs on the porch, got a pretty good bark and a pretty good bite to them. Those are the big dogs on the porch at Fort Sumter. Those guns will be in the fort until the early days of World War II. We don't have to worry about enemy warships. The Germans, the Bismarck's not coming. Bismarck's been taken out by the Brits. So we have to worry about U-boats. Once in July and then in September 1942, German U-boats mined the entrance to Charleston Harbor, 2 occasions. So we still need coastal defenses. So at the fort, the guns are taken out and cut up for scrap. They'll put 4 90-millimeter anti-aircraft guns in there, not to shoot planes, but to shoot at U-boats. And also put some 30 caliber machine guns in there, and there's submarine netting out beyond the fort in the main channel. So this is the status of the fort until after World War II. The Army considers it obsolete. It's closed by the Army. And in 1947, it's turned over to the National Park Service in 1948 and designated first Fort Sumter National Monument. And then in 2019, it becomes Fort Sumter Fort Moultrie National Historical Park. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, you can stick me with a fork.
Any questions?
Yeah. Here we go.
Yes, sir?
Yeah, well, considering how quickly the forts have come the first time in the Civil War, has anybody written anything or surmised that it was just a bad idea in the first place and the fort never should have been put there and the money never should have been spent?
Well, the example is, once again, we have the British coming. We have the fight at Fort McHenry, and eventually the British come down and take Washington, D.C. So we need coastal defenses of some sort. And this is around the world. Coastal defenses have been around in riverways, harbors, bays, oceans since ancient times. You have to guard yourself against invasion from the sea. And of course, here in Charleston, we have the British coming in and putting Charleston under siege and surrendering in May of 1780. And that's technically the 3rd largest surrender of United States troops in the nation's history. So, coastal defenses. So they're doing what technology and what their military capabilities tell them is the best thing to do, are guarding us in invasion from the sea. You gotta have good coastal defenses. Because you don't want an enemy naval force to come up and capture an important coastal city like Charleston or Baltimore or New York or whatever, and then they can establish a base of operations there for their army to operate in the interior. So, that's the mindset there. But after World War II, with aircraft carriers, high altitude, long range bombers, et cetera, and what happens in Japan and all this, at the end of the war. So all these forts essentially are obsolete, so they don't really go out of obsolescence. Because once again, we still have U-boats out there in World War II, just off our shoreline. So you still have to have some type of coastal defense, even through into World War II.
Did not Fort Moultrie and Johnston do a pretty darn good job of it? They destroyed this fort.
There was almost no exterior structural damage done to Fort Sumter from the Confederate bombardment in 1861. It's what, on the interior, yes, they were very successful, but that was all rebuilt. It's the advent and development of rifle artillery. These brick forts, like Fort Pulaski, Fort Sumter, Fort Jefferson, Dry Tortugas, Fort Hamilton, Fort Hancock, they were all made to withstand being hit by solid cast iron cannonballs. Those cannonballs could hit, crush some brick, and then bounce off or do some penetration, and that's it. But warships at that time don't have stabilizers on them. The ships are rocking and rolling in the waves and the water action. So they cannot be precise to hit the same point time and time again. So that's the technology of solid cannonballs hitting something solid and resisting that. And the ships can't stay in one place and continue to do it. But with the advent of rifle artillery, elongated, more modern shaped projectiles that are spinning and being able with greater accuracy, speed, and range. And they also have developed called contact fuses and delay fuses. So now these rifle artillery projectiles can hit with sufficient force and drive into the wall of the fort and then detonate and blow a hole in the fort. And if you're on a land-based unit like the Federal Army was on Morris Island, you can hit the same spot time and time again and reduce the walls of the fort. They did it at Fort Pulaski in April of 1862. They do it again, starting against Fort Sumter in the summer of 1863. Brick forts, in fact, from April of 1862, brick and stone forts, because of rifle artillery, are obsolete around the world. That type of fortification. That's why we end up with reinforced concrete installations inside places like Fort Sumter.
Did the ironclads have rifled?
Yes, they had 200-pounder and 100-pounder rifle, Parrott rifles, firing rifle artillery projectiles. But once again, the confines of the gun port doesn't give them a lot of elevation for distance firing. Once again, they don't have stabilizers on these ships, so the ships are moving as the current and the waves are moving in, so they can't be precise in hitting the same target or the same area or the same wall time and time again. So yes, they do have some rifle artillery on those ships on April 7th, 1863.
How could in this case the North fabricate, ship, and install on the boats all those big cannonballs? That's a massive thing.
Well, they would be made in foundries.
Yeah.
And then put on ships and brought down to the vessels and loaded on board.
But they needed them like day after day after day.
Well, there was literally 24/7, there was a constant stream of United States Army and Navy vessels coming down the Atlantic coast from places like New York and Boston and Philadelphia and constantly resupplying the United States Army with provisions, quartermaster stores, commissary stores, ordnance stores, uniforms, tents, everything. There's a constant stream of supplies of those things coming down. Same thing with the Union armies in the field, the Army of the Potomac operating in Virginia. Things are coming down and being offloaded in the case of like in 1864 and going up against Petersburg, the siege of Petersburg, they're being offloaded at Fort Monroe and put on ships coming up the James and Appomattox River, offloaded on the wharves. At the siege of Petersburg in 1864, the United States Army built a rail line going behind the Union lines, and from the bakeries, the United States, the Union soldiers in the trenches were getting fresh, warm, baked bread. They got it down to that good. And the Confederates is going, can I have a piece of that? Oh, look, mule meat over here. Ooh, tasty stuff. So
That's all well and good, but that's not trying to transport 1,000 pounds, whether they were cannonballs.
the largest were 440 pounds.
Okay, 440 pound cannonballs.
But once again, they knew how to, they had the capabilities, knowledge, skills, and abilities to do that. As we could say, Yankee ingenuity. Yes, sir.
Yeah, with the Union losses of its naval ships, have any of those been found and raised in the harbor?
We know where the USS Patapsco is, which struck a Confederate mine, and we know what's left of the Keokuk. But what happens is, in order to improve you gotta get the wrecks out of the channel to improve navigation. So twice after the war, the U.S. Military came in and whatever they couldn't recover, they put depth charges on and blew them. So they got so anything from wooden ships to warships to Confederate blockade runners, if they were anywhere a navigational hazard in the channel, they put charges on them and blew them up. So there's parts out there, but there's nothing like this. Yes, sir, in the back.
I believe you said 70% of the ships could sneak through the blockade that the Union had?
Over the course of the war, from 1861 to 1865, so the course of the entire 4 years, of course, as the war progressed, that percentage goes down because the United States Navy gets better and better. In fact, after 1863, when the siege starts, the majority of the blockade runners are going up out of Wilmington and then out of Wilmington, North Carolina. But once again, overall, Charleston's going to be the most successful port for the entire Confederacy. Once again, there's a wonderful book on that called Lifeline of the Confederacies by Dr. Stephen Wise, who's director of the Marine Corps Museum down at Parris Island. It's a wonderful book, and that's considered the source book on the Confederacy's blockade running activity. He's also got another great book called Gate of Hell, The Campaign through Charleston Harbor, 1863, which gives a detailed study of the operations on board side.
And Rick has a great book. Thunder in the Harbor. He's gonna have some of this available if you want to learn more and read his wonderful research and all that he's done on this topic. We'll have those out front, but thank you all so much for coming. We so appreciate it.
One last thing. When I came to Fort Sumter, the only history of Fort Sumter was this booklet written for the centennial, and then they put out another one in 1984. These are no longer in print. So this is my book on Fort Sumter. As I tell folks, it's the worst book ever written on the history of Fort Sumter, and the best book because it's the only book.
Thank you so much.